Many people are already aware of black individuals owning slaves in the colonies, but if you weren't, well then, there you go. Firstly, we'd like to say that focusing on just the English colonies in this regard omits the global nature of slavery. Slavery in various forms was happening all throughout history and was a normal part of life in just about every part of the world. But just because it was seen as normal does not make it any less inhumane. But we'd like to focus on this aspect of history. Of the 300 to 400,000 free African Americans, around 3,500 of them owned African slaves, or about 1%. They had relative equality with the white community during this early period of colonial settlement, and about 20% of them also owned their own homes in Virginia. One very notable one was Anthony Johnson. One misconception about him was that many claim him to be the first slave owner in America, when in fact he was not. However, he was one of the first legal slave owners to own slaves arbitrarily. Prior to Johnson versus Parker case, it was not entirely clear-cut what the legal status of the enslaved Africans was in the colonies, and they were not explicitly defined as slaves. Initially, they were treated as indentured servants, similar to many European indentured servants who worked for a set period of time to repay their passage to the colonies. But that was only in the legal concept. Realistically speaking, these indentured servants were treated no differently than if they were enslaved individuals. Johnson's indentured servant, John Casa, challenged his status as a slave and sought freedom through the legal system. Johnson successfully argued that Casa was his property for life and successfully convinced a Northampton County Court to rule in his favour. This case played a significant role in establishing legal precedents that solidified the institution of slavery and provided a clearer legal framework for the enslavement of Africans and their descendants in the American colonies. Although other cases would determine Africans to be slaves for life for a reason such as John Punch, Casa was one of the first to be declared a slave arbitrarily. It helped further entrench the racialized system of slavery that would endure for centuries. Another misconception was that African Americans only had slaves to avoid their own families from being enslaved by white individuals and living a worse life. History documents that, for the most part, they treated their slaves generally the same as all of the other slave owners, as was the norm. It was only in certain parts of the colonies, such as in Mississippi, where 12% of the free population of blacks owned slaves and the majority of them owned their own family. In fact, one prominent case was that of Dilsy Pope, a free woman of colour from Columbus, Georgia. According to historical accounts, after a quarrel between them, Dilsy Pope sold her husband to a white slave owner. Unfortunately, the white slave owner refused to sell him back to Dilsy Pope once the couple had reconciled. Quite honestly, it doesn't seem much different than what women would do today if given that choice. Similar to that was William Johnson, who was a free African-American barber and businessman in Natchez, Mississippi during the early 19th century. He owned enslaved individuals, including his own family members. However, Johnson's ownership of his family members and his position within the racially divided society led to complexities and challenges in his relationships. For example, Johnson faced difficulties when his wife, Anne, expressed a desire for their freedom, and their relationship became strained. Ironically, he was shot by his biracial neighbour who was considered a free black as well. This would have been considered black-on-black crime had the neighbour not lied and said he was white and Amerindian at the time, since blacks could not testify in court against whites. Also in Natchez, Mississippi, was Andrew Durnford. Andrew Durnford was a notable free man of colour who lived in Natchez, Mississippi during the early 19th century. He is known for his ownership of 77 enslaved individuals at the time of his death and his involvement in plantation operations. Here are a few more examples. Paul Cuff. Paul Cuff was a prominent free African-American businessman and activist in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He owned a trading vessel and engaged in maritime trade. Cuff advocated for the resettlement of free African Americans in Sierra Leone, Africa. However, he faced criticism because he owned several enslaved individuals, including family members, which conflicted with his anti-slavery activism. Paul Jennings. Paul Jennings was born into slavery and eventually gained his freedom. He became a skilled tailor and worked in the White House during the presidencies of James Madison and James Monroe. After gaining his freedom, Jennings purchased the freedom of his wife, Fanny, who was still enslaved. However, due to financial difficulties, Jennings had to place Fanny under the ownership of a white woman with an agreement that she would eventually be freed. These stories highlight the complexities of race, power, and personal gain. They challenge our understanding of the era and remind us that history is multifaceted. It's important to note that it is up for debate whether free blacks owning slaves was out of benevolence or exploitation. However, based on the psychology of people and historical documents, it can be safely assumed that at the end of the day, some people are only out for personal gain. As we conclude our journey, remember that history is not always straightforward. It's important to examine diverse perspectives and navigate the nuances of the past. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this video. Leave your thoughts and comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.